Before passing the floor to our first speaker, I would like to acknowledge the help by a group of generous-spirited people who have worked hard on making this event happen. This conference, as I mentioned, is an outcome of cooperation between two principal organizers. As with the last year, one of the principal organizers for this year is the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at the Munk Center for International Studies, better known with its acronym CERS. I can see several CERS students in the room, and they can rightly confirm the school's reputation as a leading institution in Canada for the study of Eurasian region. And I think this explains why CERS is the optimal venue for a panel of this kind that tries to disseminate knowledge about a distant but a highly strategic part of the world. On the CERS side, one person, Dr. Robert Austin, who will also be speaking to you on foreign policy options of Azerbaijan, deserves a special acknowledgement. Without his excitement, experience, and energy, neither this nor last year's event could have been possible. So I say thank you, Professor Austin, for all involvement in this project, for the last year and also for this year. And the other co-sponsor of, there will be more acknowledgements coming. The other co-sponsor of this event is the Assembly of Canadian Azerbaijani Associations. It's an umbrella organization bringing together about 10 associations that deal with various aspects of life in the diaspora. It was founded several years ago, and since then has grown into a robust organization. On the Assembly side, Dr. İlham Akundov, professor at Waterloo University.
I just want to emphasize that I've always been fascinated by Azerbaijani politics. Azerbaijan is certainly not my specialty. My focus is really more on the Western former Soviet Union, Ukraine, Russia, Moldova. But I nonetheless have been doing work on a larger project to try to explain why some authoritarian regimes are stable, and in other words, incumbents were able to stay in power, whereas others, other autocrats are not. And I think some of the lessons might be applied to Azerbaijan. So basically, what I want to talk to you today about is explaining stability and instability of authoritarian regimes in the former Soviet Union. As many of you know, the early 2000s witnessed quite photogenic and numerous collapses of authoritarian regimes, only some of which actually led to democracies. In Georgia in 2003, Ukraine in 2004, and Kyrgyzstan in 2005. And at the same time, this, while there was some optimism initially, the colored revolution more or less stopped in Kyrgyzstan in 2005. So the question is, why these three cases and not the other cases in the CIS? So first of all, I wanted today in this presentation, I'm going to basically, examine well, in some ways, the dominant interpretation of the colored revolutions, which focuses on the revolutions as a kind of wave, as a kind of product of diffusion and shared strategies and symbols, and argue that this, in fact, that the colored revolutions was in fact not a wave, and that the diffusion that did exist between cases of Georgia and Ukraine, diffusion did go on, but it was largely, from a causal point of view, rather meaningless in terms of explaining the final outcome. And instead I want to focus on another variable which looks at the sort of strength of the party-state organization. I'm going to explain that in great detail as we go along. Now first, when we talk about the colored revolutions, and just to remind you what the colored revolutions were, we had the fall of Shevardnadze in Georgia in 2003, followed is that if you look at what is uniting Ukraine, Georgia, and Kyrgyzstan, is that in everywhere else in the former Soviet Union, you have at least one pillar, a high score, on the three sources of autocrat strength.
But the European Union should see stability in the Caucasus no differently than they saw stability in Southeastern Europe or stability in East Central Europe in the aftermath of communism, because the costs are still relatively low, and the possibility for success are actually quite high. And my message again for Azerbaijan is very simple. Anchor yourself as often as possible in as many Western organizations as you can, because that's going to provide you with the kind of independence that Azerbaijan actually wants. Now that said, comparing back to the Balkans and to the Caucasus, the geopolitical interests in your region are simply mind-boggling. Not just politically, but religiously, ethnically, and as Aslan said, this east-west, north-south axis, it really is. You're right in the epicenter of this whole region. So when you throw in Russia, Turkey, Iran, Georgia, etc., this is a conundrum. This is not Balkans, and there is no consensus at all in the region as to what should happen. And as you know, those of you who are specialists on the region, Russia has no interest in anything but the status quo. That is Russian foreign policy, status quo. And I believe that. Elshani, we can talk more about this because you're going to shed certainly more light on that than I am. But Russia's interest also in Kosovo was actually went from status quo to hoping for illegality. Russia wanted Kosovo to become illegally independent. They put up this judicial arguments, but that was a smokescreen. They wanted an illegal Kosovo, because an illegal Kosovo is the only thing they can live with. Now is that you don't have that coalition of interests where you had in Kosovo, where the EU, NATO, United States said, Kosovo will be independent. Balkans will be part of the European Union, Balkans will be part of NATO. This is a full stop. And again, the Russians made a lot of noise, but they didn't really take it that seriously. And I'm not saying, I'm not trying to belittle what the Russians tried to do at the Security Council, but again, Russians don't have huge interest in the Balkans anymore. This is lost for them. Balkans is lost completely. Caucasus is not lost. Any movement forward in this issue, and this is utterly regrettable. And I'll come back to that. 20 more years of status quo, again, as I said, that has huge implications for Azerbaijan. Now let me talk, Aslan, I told Aslan I would give my perspective on Azerbaijani foreign policy. Azerbaijan has to have a set of priorities, and I think Azerbaijan has basically three priorities. The first one is obvious to everybody in this room, which is the settlement of the Karabakh issue that is favorable to Azerbaijan. This is the most important foreign policy goal for Azerbaijan right now. And I can talk about that in the question period, about how Kosovo is actually irrelevant for Azerbaijan. But we will leave that for the discussion.
I think after distinguished panel, Professor Austin, Professor Wade, Mr. Aliyev, 4 days ago I was in a village, ancestral village in Azerbaijan, southwest of Baku. I flew to Moscow to catch a plane to New York to Washington, D.C. yesterday, and flew from Washington to Toronto. So if I say something incomprehensible, not only in English, but also in Azerbaijani, please forgive me, because unlike most of the young people here, when you get older, jet lag does do its negative sides to you. So forgive me if I'm a little bit jet lagged. I also like to take this opportunity to thank the organizers, and particularly Professor Akhundov, for inviting me to this beautiful city of Toronto, as well as for his dedication to the cause of Azerbaijan. I know Ilham for more than 20 years. I know that he is one of the most honorable Azerbaijanis you would meet anywhere in the world. When I arrived in Washington, D.C. In 1992, there was literally no knowledge of Azerbaijan except among the few specialists. And when I first met Azerbaijani ambassador to Washington, D.C. in early 1993, on his arrival, it was a small, crumbly, two-room office in downtown Washington, D.C. Ladies and gentlemen, what a tremendous, tremendous progress here in Toronto. Azerbaijani diaspora, with the help of the distinguished university and international center, is organizing such a wonderful conference. What a progress! A few days ago, Azerbaijani singers won the contest, the third place in the Eurovision contest. It's absolutely tremendous progress given the 15 past years, which is by historical standards is a very small period of time. But what I would like to begin by saying is that the progress that Azerbaijan has made in the past 15 to 17 years has been absolutely tremendous. What I'd like to, if you don't mind, to talk about oil and gas developments, which are much easier to talk about the political and regimes, political side of the story, foreign policy and regime changes. And I also, in this context, I'd like to thank both Lugan and Robert for the absolutely fantastic presentations, because which makes my job much easier to talk about oil and gas developments than about the foreign policy and social sciences. What I'd like to do is to give you a brief description of the interests, actions, and contractions of both regional powers, Russia, Turkey, Iran, and to some extent China, as well as extra-regional players. By that I mean, by and large, United States, EU, and to some extent Japan. In the early 1990s, when Soviet Union collapsed, there was a literally political, military, financial, economic chaos and vacuum in Caspian region. There was no particularly well put out policies by Russia in the Caucasus because as the Soviet Union collapsed, there was no understanding and no vision of how Russia should deal with the newly emerged independent states. The first and most natural instinct that the Russians had was to support separatist regimes here and there in order to, apparently, as they understood it, as they perceived it, to put the pressure on the governments like in Baku, in Moldova, in Chisinau, in Ukraine, and in Tbilisi. It manifested itself in Azerbaijan's case, support for the Armenian forces in Nagorno-Karabakh. In Georgia's case, support for Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and in Moldova's case, support for Pridnestrovia.
Currently serving as the director of America section at the Ministry of Diaspora of Azerbaijan. In 1990s, he worked as the head of the President's Task Force on Strategic Issues. This is my translation of the term, so it might not be 100% accurate, but that's a job that involves kind of keeping track of which intentions all these international powers have, and to predict the kind of disruptions that might happen to international contracts due to this nuances in international relations, to conflicting interests. And Mr. Aliyev has been director of that task force, and he has therefore participated in almost all important oil and gas contracts, including the contract of the century. So he's not just going to speak about his perspective as a senior official from the Ministry of Diaspora, but also as someone who's been involved in the process. And yesterday, while we were having conversation with Mr. Aliyev, I was surprised and delighted by the amount of first-hand knowledge that he has on these issues, and I hope that he will be generous in sharing those with the audience today. I will invite Mr. Aliyev to the podium. The way we hope to proceed is he will speak in Azerbaijani, and I will be translating it to English for the Anglophone crowd.
Ülkemizde bu konferansı teşkil eden değerli müsteşarlar, diaspora komitesi adına müsteşarlar.
First of all, I'd like to express my gratitude to all those who have worked in organizing this conference. On behalf of the Azerbaijani Diaspora Ministry, I would say thank you.
Bugün Azerbaycan ünvanına herkes
today a lot of nice words were said about Azerbaijan, and in my part of the conference, I would like to speak about the role of energy resources in determining foreign policy of Caspian Sea basin countries.
Bu meseleleri tarihine bir balaca ekspos etmeyi istedim çünkü çok manalı bir tarihi var.
I'd like to have a brief introduction to the history of these contracts and the developments that the speakers have been alluding to.
Some people understand Azerbaijani, a lot of people.
Ona göre mikrofon var mı?
No, microphone is already on. Microphone is already working, guys.
Bu meselelerle bağlı dikkatinizi bir iki meselelerin üzerinde saklamak istiyorum.
I would like to pinpoint two or three very central issues.
Tarihe getirdim ki ben Azerbaycan 3 prezidentiyle işleme mühendisi oldu.
I've been lucky to have the opportunity to work with 3 presidents of Azerbaijan.
Azerbaycan neft yatakları artık muharebeden sonra hususuyla Xəzər dənizindəki neft yatakları 49. yıldan artık işlemeye başladı.
The development of the Caspian Sea basin oil wells of Azerbaijan started in after the World War II in 1949.
90'lı yıllara kadar bu neft yataklarında artık geoloji işler bağlamıştır ve neftin miktarı hakkında dəqiq məlumatlar var idi.
Geological investigations had been conducted prior to the 1990s, and they already had solid information on how much oil we were looking into.
SSR devletinin kifayet kadar investisyon imkanları olmadığına göre bu yatakların işlenmesi geleceğe saklanmış.
USSR did not have the financial capacity and technological capacity to start using all these resources because these were in the seabed, and for that reason that had been postponed until
90'lı yıllarda artık Azerbaycan müstəqilliğini kazandıktan sonra Azerbaycan birinci prezidenti bu investorların cəlb edilmesi istiqamətində ciddi adımlar atmaya başladı.
In the early 1990s, when Azerbaijan regained its independence, the first president of Azerbaijan started taking serious steps to attract foreign investment.
İlk baştan bu aslan bir meseledir. Lakin hayat gösterdi ki böyle adımları atmak isteyen şahıs öz hakimiyetini yitirmek mecburiyetinde kaldı. Yani devlet çevrilişinin neticesinde o birinci prezident devrildi.
You know, from the first look, it might look like a very easy thing to do, a very natural thing to do, but life proved that a president who tries to run serious risks, and the first president was victim of a coup attempt, a successful coup.
92. yılda artık bu lahiyeler, bu investor cəlb etmə işləri davam ettirildi ve 93. yılın Eylül ayında artık ikinci defa bu kontraktan kol çekilmesi için London'da artık işler yapıldı. BP, Statoil başta olmakla Amerika şirketleriyle birlikte.
And after the first coup, this work about attracting foreign investment continued under the second president, and in June of 1993, there were serious preparations for signing a contract in London, England.
Ve ikinci prezidente karşı da artık devlet çevrilişi oldu ve o da hakimiyetten uzaklaştırıldı.
There was a coup against the second president as well, just about that time.
Bu bir daha gösterdi ki yani tecrübesi olmayan bir şahıs ülkede yani bu neft amilinden istifade edip Azerbaycan'a investorların cəlb etmesi imkanı yok.
This proved that someone without experience cannot try to make use of the oil factor. It will just result in catastrophe for himself.
Bu zaman Azerbaycan halkı Heydar Aliyev'e müracaat etti ve Heydar Aliyev ikinci defa hakimiyete kayıttı ve bu neft kontratlarının üstünde işlemeye başladı.
there was a general appeal at this moment for the former leader of Azerbaijan during the Soviet time, Heydar Aliyev, to return to power, and Heydar Aliyev returned to power in Azerbaijan.
Bununla o kadar asıl mesele olmadı, bir daha sübut olundu. Çünkü Heydar Aliyev 1993 yılı sentyabr ayı 22'sinde bu kontraktı Bakı'da imzaladılar. Ve imzalama merasiminde bir ay geçenden sonra yeniden Heydar Aliyev'in hakimiyetinin devrilmesi için yine devlet çevirişine cehd oldu.
And this contract was finally signed, but just 1 month after the contract was signed, there was another coup attempt.
Bu çevirişin karşısı demek ki o tecrübe ve bilik hesabına Heydar Aliyev tarafından alındı.
Experience and knowledge of the new president helped to counter this coup.
Kontrakt yavaş yavaş işlemeye başladı. Lakin 1995 yılında yine de ben konkret o ülkelerin adlarını da çekeceğim, orada olan mühim bölgelerden de istinad edeceğim. Yine de 95 yılında yine Heydar Aliyev'in hakimiyetini yıkmak için ikinci sefer devlet çevirişine cehd olundu.
There was a second coup against Heydar Aliyev in 1995, and now I will name those facts about the countries that were involved in this coup.
Artık tecrübeli bir şahs, devletin mühim atributlarını kurmuş bir insan gibi bu çevirişinde karşısı Heydar Aliyev tarafından alındı ve kontrakt yavaş yavaş böyle işlemeye başladı.
And this coup attempt was also countered thanks to the political experience of the new government and Heydar Aliyev personally, and the contract was moving ahead.
Kontrakt işlemeye başladıktan sonra artık Garp ülkelerinin, o cümleden Amerika Birleşmiş Devletleri'nin investorlarını Azerbaycan'da cemleşmeye başladı.
And this resulted in an increase of the number of investors in Azerbaijan from the United States, from European countries.
Dikkatinize bir mesele çarptırmak istedim ki Azerbaycan mesela gazı her Rusya'dan alır. Ama neft yataklarını araştıran biyoloji araştırmalar neticesinde neft evezde gaz ihtiyatları çıkmaya başladı ve gazdan istifade meselesi gündeme geldi.
And I would like to pinpoint the fact that Azerbaijan was a consumer of Russian gas in early 1990s, but thanks to the geological discoveries, in the process of looking for oil reserves, geologists also discovered gas reserves, and so there was a new question about how to bring those to the market.
Bugünleri geoloji sağlamalara göre ve expertlerin verdiği karara göre bir yılda 20 milyar kilometre gaz biz Azerbaycan'ın garibe ihraç etme imkanları var.
Today, experts give us such numbers as 20 million cubic meters of annual gas production is possible.
İhtiyatlar ise 20 trilyon kilometre civarında hakkında yani expert reyleri var. Burada 100 yıl müddetinde Azerbaycan'ın gaz expert imkanları hakkında demeye esas verir.